Stanford University.
Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Andy Freeman. This is WE380, Winter 2010-2011. I believe this is the last class of the quarter. The other course organizer is Dennis Allison. Since it's the last class of the quarter, last chance to say that assignments must be done by the end of finals week, and no incompletes. As I often say, that the cool stuff happens after the cameras go off, but today is going to be an exception because after the cameras go off, the speaker is going to leave. So we're going to end on time today.
Well, it's either that or you have to deal with my wife.
Okay.
I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
I can leave.
No, it's not a fair fight. I guarantee you.
As his bio says, today's speaker, James Gosling, has been involved in many of the transitions that we've had over the past 4 decades. From mainframes to minis, minis to personal to the web. And he also did one of my favorite things, one of the applications I spent a considerable amount of time, namely Emacs, brought it to C and took it off of Tico. Something he probably didn't want to remember. However, today's talk is not about technology. It's about a much more important problem, namely how to succeed with technology. And it's arguably not in the purview of 380 because you don't succeed in technology with technology. The answer is not better technology. In fact, good enough wins so often that it's probably true that better is bad. Worse is better, whatever you want to say it. Instead, there's social factors that matter. Timing, money, who's involved, phase of the moon, all sorts of strange things. None of them are technology. And today's speaker, James Gosling, has succeeded often enough that if it's luck, he's got it.
Hi. So this talk is actually one I wrote about 10 years ago. I think I've given this talk about once every 6 months for the last 10 years. Edited it, a little bit every time, and somehow or other it manages to stay remarkably relevant because there's when you go through school and you learn a whole lot about engineering, you learn a lot about ideas, but not a whole lot about what the hell to do with the ideas. And so that's kind of what this is about. And innovation really has kind of two phases. One is creating an idea, and then the hard part that they never ever begin to tell you about in school is once you've got a good idea, how do you deliver it? So when creativity is something that people wonder about. Where does it come from? We're all creative. Creativity is something that's not so much about finding creativity, but just sort of letting go and allowing yourself to be creative. And a little bit of talent helps. It doesn't it isn't always necessary. I mean, you don't have to be Vincent van Gogh. Arguably, he was a very talented guy. He ended up dead young and never made a penny off of anything that he did. But talent helps a lot. And when people, particularly in like companies that have like R&D departments or whatever, there's this question of just how innovative do you want to be? And people talk about like advanced development groups and research groups, and really that's this it's the sort of forward projecting, question about is it sort of a long-term project or is it a short-term project? And most of the stuff that people do at universities are hopefully really, really long-term. Most of the stuff that universities do are so long-term that no company could possibly fund them, without being roasted by their accountants. And there's this kind of sort of fan of the amount of innovation you're able to do is sort of proportional to the distance forward you're going to go. But it also drives the amount of risk, the amount of indeterminacy. You really don't know what the future is going to be. There's a few things you can kind of hang your hat on, but not a whole lot. And so you can make you can try to make great big leaps. Most often, if you try to make a great big leap, you will completely fail because the place you will land is like because you're always leaping blind. You do a lot better by being lucky, standing in a good place where you think good stuff might happen, and then hope that the ship of luck comes and sweeps you off. And what most people in the industrial world view as innovation is sort of making a lot of little steps, and you can do a lot of really cool innovation, small steps at a time. And that really is what most people do. It's a lot more deterministic, but it looks like in analysis of algorithms, you study the greedy algorithms, and so sort of the short-term innovation is fundamentally a greedy algorithm because you're kind of looking at the next thing and you're kind of climbing the hill that seems to be here, and you'll never notice the mountain that's over there, and finding the mountain over there is. It's kind of like an annealing problem, right? You have to throw some random numbers in there and go for a big leap. But then you'll never know where you're going to land, and you have to kind of incrementalize yourself up to the peak. And so you can actually think of innovation as an algorithm. It is something you can easily study. One of the things that's incredibly important is to have a vision of like where you're going to try to be in 10 or 15 years, and maybe it's kind of unrealistic. I tended to get a lot of my vision from like reading science fiction novels and going through them, and it's kind of like what's the world I want to live in? Would I rather live in the world of Star Trek or Blade Runner? And if you think about the difference between Blade Runner and Star Trek, it's a lot of that pushes lots of buttons about things like security. So I kind of have this thing about building systems that are secure. It's just like not even a negotiation with me. If the systems aren't safe and they don't kill the people that are using it. I really care about that, and lots of folks end up with this sort of view that security is a feature that you add on afterwards, and that feels to me very much like oddly enough, yeah, they're still trying to add more and more binder twine and. Stuff more, life vests in the airplane, but it just doesn't work. And when I look at folks like Facebook, that really has this sort of Blade Runner feeling to me, and I just like no, thank you. And that if you just think about the stories you read, the movies you watch, and think about what that kind of future would be and what kind of principles that you get from those dreams sort of put on you, that can provide a certain sort of framework about where you're going to innovate. I mean, if you come up with some really, really cool idea, but you can't figure out how to make it secure, well, try again. At least in my book. I mean, other people would differ. And when you're doing innovation in some area, it's in some sense it's almost like writing a play. It's almost like literature, right? There's a cast of characters. There are motivations, right? So if you're trying to do, like I've got a bunch of friends in various places who are trying to do systems IT systems for healthcare. But if you're trying to do IT systems for healthcare, or trying to solve the healthcare IT problem, you have to understand who's the cast of characters in the healthcare system, right? You got to understand, the patients, the doctors, the insurance companies, the hospitals, the drug companies, and all the rest of them, to try to figure out, or at least, you don't have to like map it out in detail. But if you come up with some like really great idea that patients will love but doctors will hate, it's not going to go anywhere, right? And the world is littered with people who have like great ideas that half the world is going to love and half the world is going to hate, and then bam, you just get torched. And it really is a lot like thinking about a play and planning out a play and thinking about how these folks are motivated. And because a lot of these areas have complex casts of characters, it gets pretty messy. And often what you end up doing is shaping your design, not to fit some view of engineering purity or academic excellence or anything like that, but what the hell can you snake by the noses of the people who are out there? If you're trying to do anything in like the media world, you can try to shove things down the throats of the movie companies, or you can try to work with them. It's like, who are you going to turn into your enemy or your friend? When you're coming up with ideas, all of these things provide a big chunk of the context. And one of the things that I really loved about the way that the folks at Xerox PARC used to work was that they used to just sort of assume that the future was going to come, give everybody some completely impossible system, and design for the future. That's become somewhat hard to do, but you have to if you can figure out what is today's exotic, and then sort of design for that. It's lots of folks were pretty skeptical about running software on cell phones. And certainly when we at Sun started the whole software on cell phones thing 12 years ago, most folks thought we were nuts. Fortunately, we got sort of a prototype together that actually fit the envelope, ran into some folks in Japan who actually thought this was a good idea. NTT Docomo rolled something out that was actually like remarkably cool a decade ago. All the other phone companies were going, what happened? And it worked, right? And it helped to have, a partner who could also be a champion, who is willing to think way outside the box. As phone companies go, NTT Docomo is pretty darned exceptional. Then, and in some sense, actually, Docomo was a really bad company to work with because, it sort of sets the expectation that other phone companies are like Docomo. And then, after like another decade of, getting blood on the forehead as you just bang your heads against the wall because they're incredibly boneheaded. And I can say that because I'm unemployed. And so when you go and you talk to folks about innovations, often when you talk to them, they get all confused about today and tomorrow. It's really easy for people to get stuck on, well, how would you do that with like today's cell phones or today's laptops or today's network connectivity? These things aren't changing very much, are they? And some of them are, and some of them aren't. And if you can get some kind of a view of what the change vectors are and the technologies underneath. We've had this pretty reliable predictor in Moore's law. Moore's law kind of took a little shift a few years ago when everybody kind of got used to Moore's law driving clock count or clock rate, and it sort of shifted over to multi-core and kind of different kinds of cores. But the exponential is still there, and as near as anybody can tell, it's going to be exponential for a long, long time. And so when we started doing stuff with OpenGL on cell phones 7 years ago, it seemed kind of crazy. But now it's impossible to buy a chipset for a cell phone class machine that doesn't have OpenGL on the chip. And it was, almost, it's just kind of do the math, right? This is what happens with the number of gates. How many gates will you have on something that costs $5? What do you think people are going to do with it? The number one, driver of the consumption of computation on the planet is games. And what do people do on small handhelds? Games. That's what's going to happen on cell phones. Remarkably straightforward and obvious. And one of the problems with that people often run into when they start sort of predicting the future is if you aren't really careful, you can run into what some people used to refer to, although it's sort of a forgotten term, the Osborn Effect. It's sort of a forgotten term because of what Osborn did, namely, he sort of predicted the future, said we will be making this machine in, this much time, and people just started, okay, I'll wait until you've got that machine, and then I'll buy that, and then his revenue went to zero, and Osborn Computer went out of business before they actually produced the machine that he was predicting, and so that tends to drive a lot of the secrecy that you see. Everybody from Apple on down is pretty tight-lipped about just about everything they do. One of the things that's really, really hard in companies is the whole issue of risk. I mean, one of the things about research is that, if you know the answer, then it's not research, right? And so if you're not failing often enough, you're not being innovative enough. I mean, it's kind of an axiom, right? And at a research lab, one of the things you have to do is to demand failure. Not constant failure, but just enough failure to have some good feeling that you're reasonably close to the edge, and you end up with your success through sort of diversity in investments. And when you drive up Sand Hill Road and you look at all the venture capitalists, that's kind of what they do. I mean, they're sitting there at sort of a 5 or 10% success rate, maybe. Although they kind of lost touch with what success means. Their success always has some dollars in it, and it's really hard to extract dollars from any kind of success. And in companies, one of the if you talk about risk and failure, and there's like an accountant in the room, they run screaming away from you. And you can't, you used to put, probabilities out in front and yada, 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 and they still got run screaming from the room. And, when you look at companies that become sort of large, risk becomes a sort of a difficult thing because doing some piece of research and development, that's an expense today, shows up as a drain on their books, and then even when you come up with a good idea and it actually works, then they've got to put money into it to start making money. So there's this like drain in cash until they start making money. But if you so a bunch of the way that a bunch of companies work, and my immediately preceding employer was one of these. In their view, innovation is evil, and in fact, instead of innovating, what you do is you acquire companies. And from an accountant's point of view, that works great because you don't have to put any money at risk. You put out, you net are putting out a whole lot more money than you would have if you actually built it yourself. But also there's this twisted thing that happens where, if you spend $1 billion to buy a company instead of investing $100 million to make the same technology, it's actually cheaper to spend $1 billion. Because when you talk to the accountants, right, when you buy a company, you're not spending money. You're actually changing the form of an asset, right? Because you've got an asset that's cash, and turning that into an asset, which is this company that you've just acquired. So net on your books, it's zero. And they go, it's zero, I don't care, right? Cash flow is negative $1 billion, but it nets out, right? And so when you talk to lots of big companies, they just innovation is just like a bad idea, and you spend any time with their accountants, and you go, yeah, I guess so. Yeah, it's kind of the reality of the way Wall Street works.
I think it's a bit of a generalization.
Well, it is a huge generalization. I mean,
I think there's a bigger problem than the accountants. Like the number 2 man at JPL in my first job out of college said, he was a major general, said, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Oh yeah. And somebody just wrote a book. Reality is broken.
Reality is very broken. Reality is very broken. I mean, there are all kinds of areas where you just can't innovate for like all kinds of bizarre reasons, right? So I've been involved in various folks who've tried to do innovation in flight avionics, and doing software for avionics is really, really hard.
Yeah, how many people have you killed?
Well, I actually spent a lot of the last decade hanging out with people who do real-time software, and the real-time software crowd is entertaining because their view of a bug is it kills somebody. So when if you really want to find out how to do reliable software, go to talk to engineers who have real consequences. And a lot of this ends up getting codified in regulations of one sort or another. And so the whole process of getting avionics software certified is unbelievably expensive. The last time I talked to anybody about it, the number that somebody who I believe knows said was that it was about $3,000 a line to do the certification once. And if you change a line, there's apparently procedures for doing incremental recertifications based on a one-line change, but it is so much more complicated, it's actually cheaper to recertify the whole thing.
Yeah, but see, that still stays in the monetary aspect of it. I mean, one of my coworkers...
But it always ends up...
No, it's a little more than that, because one of my coworkers, he came out, he was a master's student at the time, and one of the things he brought out a report this thick. It was the death report of his dad, who was a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base. When he was a kid in high school, the Air Force gave him this, sorry kid, your dad died crashing this plane. And he wasn't one of the ones who really augured it and cratered. He almost made it alive, actually. The plane was just rolled over at the last second, killing him, I think. So they had an intact body.
Oh yeah.
Unlike most of the people in Tom Wolfe's book, where you're just burying little fragments of bone and stuff like that, as an example.
Yeah.
And they had this one situation where I forgot how many days it took them. 60 test pilots died in the course of testing jet engines and jet aircraft and the like. I mean, and that's not easily a thing monetarily.
I understand it, right? And people get all kinds of weird prejudices that make them resistant to all kinds of changes, and that's what the sort of understand the cast of characters, understand what their motivations are, understand what they think about it, and so many of these things, when you start trying to reason with people in the music and movie industry, they're working from a set of principles that are last had a significant change in the 18th century. They're still working on sort of contract law boilerplate from the days of when sheet music was the driving revenue source, and it just gets ugly.
So how does avionics compare to medical instrumentation and
how does avionics compare to medical instrumentation? Depends on where you are. If it's military avionics, seems to be no real problem. If it's medical instrumentation outside of the U.S., not a big problem. I've certainly been to places where people happily hot melt glue gun small Linux boards onto the side of X-ray machines to turn them into data sources that put X-rays into a database, as opposed to what would have to happen here, which is way more complicated, and it gets complicated not just because you've got to get approval because when you hot melt glue gun the CPU board onto the side of the X-ray machine, did that discharge chemicals? Is this made it lethal to the patient in the room? But what does it do to the business models of all the competing companies? And, the number of sources of train wrecks is just huge. And sometimes I just want to go back to an agrarian society, right? My cousin Keith will give me a job fixing combines any day, and I often think of taking him up on it. But the success rate at research labs tends to be remarkably low. I mean, when I joined IBM Research, I asked the guy that I was about to report to, what proportion of things get out there, and he sort of figured it was 2 to 3%, and he thought that they were doing really good. And
they had a culture that said it was okay to fail.
Yeah, they had a culture that said it was okay to fail. They had all kinds of weird twists in their culture. The at least when I joined IBM Research, the company seemed to hate the labs. I mean, it was a remarkably adversarial relationship, and anything that sort of came out of the labs tended to get twisted in the most bizarre ways. I was involved in the PCRT, and sort of the thing that came out at the end was just psychotically weird compared to what any rational person would have done. And it was all sort of the political meat grinder of all the divisions in IBM, wanting to put, some version of their stamp on it.
inappropriate value added?
Inappropriate value added, indeed. I mean, they had things like the folks who do disks, forcing them to do programmed I/O instead of DMA for the disk drives because then they'd be competitive. You could do DMA to the mouse, but not to the disk, for no good reason at all, other than it pissed these people off. I guess the core problem with the PCRT is that it would do for about $10,000 what the mainframe groups were selling for 1 to 5 million, and when they go, you're going to take a revenue cut of how much? Then their idea, then it's like, well, maybe that's not a good idea. And as the crossing the chasm crowd says, if you can kill yourself with a product like this, then somebody else can. And that sort of happens over and over again, and it certainly happened with IBM.
Is that figure, by the way, it's absolute, that's not
Which?
normalized, the
Which?
1 to 5 and the 10 to 20?
Yeah.
Those are
Well-
absolute, they're not necessary. Have you thought about normalizing them? The size of the
Normalizing them
companies?
to what? To the
Size the size of the companies.
Yeah, I don't. Yeah, I don't know what normalizing would mean. I mean
The larger the company, the lower the percentage.
yeah, and there's a sort of issue with the political meat grinder. The number of grinding wheels in the meat grinder is proportional to the log of the number of employees or something.
Does it just mean that they park their money at 2 different points in the research and development axis?
Yeah, I mean IBM ended up in this world where there is no money in hardware, and so IBM's now a service company.
They started out
As a service company, that just goes back to the roots.
Yeah, yeah,
We're very proud that it started out, they had no hardware.
yeah, and kind of back themselves into that again.
Isn't the more interesting number the ratio of the amount of monies, or percentage of money taken in that's spent on research and development to the percentage of products that come out of research and development?
Yeah, I don't know how you measure it. I mean, it would be hard to get. I really don't know. I mean, certainly at Sun, we felt pretty good about our success rate from our labs, even though various folks at Sun went, what do you mean there's something failed? And often actually the issue with a lab like Sun's is there were all kinds of projects which it was clear they weren't going anywhere. They should have been killed. They have like a germ of a good idea, but that's not going anywhere. So it's sort of fail early, fail often.
But
Yeah.
there's another dimension that might explain the difference, which is attention of top management. They can only handle so many new ideas.
Right. I mean, it's certainly the case that the bigger the company is, the more distant top management is from anything that's going on, and certainly in a company like IBM, anybody who was at like the CEO or the first 2 or 3 levels below the CEO had almost no clue what was going on in the research groups, and almost no real interest. I mean, there was an awful lot of people in the stratospheric part of IBM that seemed to view the major purpose of the research group as being sucking out the talent from other companies. And they often had these really weird and perverted kind of ways of viewing it, but at the top levels they tended to not be people who knew much at all about technology. And certainly Sun was very much that way too. At least, I mean, Sun was really odd because Sun's top management was mostly engineers except for the CEO. And Scott, described himself as a guy that majored in golf. And he was actually serious about that. But he was a really good listener. He knew what he didn't know. In his heart of hearts, he was actually an economist. So he actually cared about the numbers and was pretty good about stopping goofy things. But he didn't have much of a his technical bullshit detector wasn't really good.
You know what Andy's percentage was? My understanding was basically most of these projects finally wind up in products.
I don't know. I don't know what the Andy percentage was. I mean,
And often they had a product didn't work that finally changed and picked up his project. and became
Oh,
one.
yeah, I mean, Andy projects tended to be kind of disasters, because, Andy's like a really smart guy, really good ideas, clever ideas for how to get as close to the bleeding edge as you can, not manufacturable worth shit on average. My first exposure to, Andy engineering was when I showed up at Carnegie Mellon for the PhD program. He had been at Carnegie Mellon, was moving over to Stanford, and he had done this board design for the memory controller of a multiprocessor called CM Star. And as a fresh walking in the door grad student, one of the things I got stuck on was, helping them manufacture 50 of these boards. And, when you have to check the timing of the chips to make sure that you were using because he never designed for average or worst case. You actually had to test the chips. And then there was actually something where you had to file the ends of the chips because following the usual specs, he couldn't get enough chips on the board. So you had to put them closer than the packaging would actually allow. So you actually had to file the ends off the packages. And it's so I love Andy. He builds great stuff. It's just really, really hard to, Yeah. But
Well, it's a good story, but it's not true for the Sun One. None of the chips have to be filed there.
yeah. Well, the Sun one did have its issues. I don't know
That's
the.
true.
I'm not sure whether there was a Sun. There was one of them where he actually was mounting. Was it the one or the 100U? There was one of them that really, the really early ones, where he started doing this thing where he would, instead of just mounting one chip on the board, he would mount a second chip on the board with the legs splayed out. So he would do this sort of double-decker mounting. And there were a bunch of those, and I was just like, ooh, this is cool.
Memory chips are sometimes done.
Yeah.
That wasn't true on the Sun One, though.
Yeah. No, the Sun one was pretty solid. But Andy's a really, really exceptional guy. And one of the things that's often hard when you talk to people in management is that they have a hard time, or anybody, what's the difference between sort of somebody who's being reckless and somebody who's being inspired. It's often really the dividing line between a clever technique and just batshit crazy is razor thin. And often when somebody comes in and says, "Oh, I got a great idea for doing this," you go, "That's nuts." And then if they can go, "Oh, you do this, and it'll work," and they're like, "Oh, yeah." And you gotta, with labs, there's a remarkable amount of faith required, and allowing people to take risk, because a lot of the stuff that turns out to be really interesting is stuff that just seems to be batshit crazy, and certainly Sun had a long list of batshit crazy things that actually worked out surprisingly well. Things like the whole, our whole cell phone business, the whole smart card business for us. Half of the machines we made were just stupid, but they actually worked really, really well.
What about software like NFS?
Well, NFS worked great. I mean, that NFS was considered kind of dubious because nobody had really made. I mean, the issue with NFS at the time, because the world was littered with network file systems that didn't really work, and the NFS crew had a few sort of religious principles that were kind of different, right? They and high on the list was having sort of a stateless connection, so that operations were idempotent. They have loved to use the word idempotent all the time, and that was actually just a really key thing to making NFS work across failures. I mean, the usual thing with network file systems at the time had been, they worked fine unless something went sort of unstable and you had reliability issues that the file systems tended to not recover. And NFS did a really, really good job, particularly because of this emphasis on statelessness, with actually working. And it was considered kind of crazy at the time to have a stateless connection. Because people argued that if you had a stateless connection, you would have a huge performance problem. And well, yeah, they did have a performance problem because of the statelessness, but they actually managed to claw back a lot of the performance with clever caching. And it sort of went back and forth, and then NFS actually became stateful, but with this sort of background in statelessness. But it actually sort of evolved, pretty nicely. But it was certainly considered kind of crazy at the time. And one of the things that often gets people cranky about failures in research is it's like it's almost impossible to get a PhD for a negative result, right? And yet negative results are often the most interesting. And they're certainly learning experiences, right? I mean, whether it's a research project or dating, negative results are learning experiences, and just don't worry about learning. It's always good. People also tend to like to think about innovation as something that's kind of planned, and I guess I'm a big believer in the cosmic random number generator. That most of the really interesting things out there are actually luck. The color purple, this guy William Perkins, he's the guy that sort of invented industrial chemistry. They didn't really understand how molecules fit together, and he was trying to, they knew about atoms, but they didn't understand about molecular structure. And he's this like 18-year-old kid who was like screwing around in his dad's back shed, and he was mixing stuff together trying to synthesize quinine. Absolutely no clue what he was doing. Spilled some on his pants that turned this astonishing color of purple. And then he at least went, "Ooh, cool color," and I can't wash it out. Then became a Victorian billionaire, and started all of modern industrial chemistry. But it was complete accident, but sharp kid, eyes open, and he kind of happened to know what he was sort of doing. And he had an inspiration sort of in a different area. I mean, he was trying for quinine, and he ended up in the fashion industry. And luck happens where it happens. And to some extent, luck is sort of manufacturable already. If you try to stand in places where you think interesting things might happen, and having a gut feeling of things to look at is always a good.
What was his next invention? Was there any other invention afterwards?
Yeah, he had a really.
First and last.
No, he had a really long string. If you look up Moveen in Wikipedia, there's a really long article on William Perkins. I mean, he ended up as Sir William Perkins, mega billionaire. He did all kinds of really good things, but it all started with a spill on his lab coat.
This was Mauve?
Yeah, Mauve. Yeah, and it just happened to be exactly the same color purple as you would get from this dye from this weird mollusk in the Eastern Mediterranean that was used to dye the gowns of royalty. And it was the most expensive dye on the planet. And he got this purple that was the same color as royal purple. And he kind of went, cool. I mean, there were like so many accidents intersected in that one move, right? And it's an interesting sort of piece of science history to look at. Yep.
Given your statistics from the previous page on IBM between 1% and 5%, Sun 10 to 20%, I was wondering if you had a sense of how many of those research projects that became products actually became the product that was intended when the research was started.
Did they become the product that was intended?
Or did they get halfway through the research, realize they had something else like this, and go and produce it?
Boy, I wish I had a good answer for that.
That would be a very useful piece of guidance for somebody currently trying to do this kind of research. How much should one hammer on one's original idea as opposed to really flowing with it?
Well, I mean, there's the idea and there's what you do with it. Yeah, I don't know. John, do you have any ideas, John?
Hey, I'm undercover here.
You're not undercover.
Anymore. I would have said that the number was more like 0. That ended up being used for what they were originally dreamed. Ivan's async stuff, he was going to build the world's fastest async computer. It got used at Sun for some I/O thing.
Right. It got used for a certain sort of inter-chip communication.
Yeah.
The ARPANET, nobody ever thought it would be used for email.
Actually, they did.
Well, yeah. I suspect that email was on the list, but Facebook wasn't. Or Netflix.
Bob Taylor has a thing that he did in roughly the mid-'60s, a paper that he wrote that predicts, not Facebook per se, but an ambience that's pretty close to what we got.
Oh,
Yeah.
James, you don't have the original Java business plan, do you?
I actually do. Well, because of the original business plan, I have the behind the green door plan. Do you remember the behind the green door plan?
Yeah, I do.
Anything like the movie?
I thought we looked for one of the lawsuits, James. Never mind.
What?
I thought we were looking for that plan in one of the lawsuits and didn't find it.
No, I remember actually giving a copy of it to the lawyers once for one of the lawsuits. Yeah.
Well, you see, for instance, the Java stuff, I would have said, no, it didn't hit the original intent. Until a decade later, every Blu-ray player, for God's sakes,
Yeah.
I mean, the original Java stuff was for that, then it went way everywhere else.
Yeah.
And it ended up back where it close.
Yeah, it's ended up close in part. The cell phone VM kind of ended up where it started being, but that one was a little more. That one was a little more predictable. I think just about everything everybody does in any research lab takes a very wiggly turn, and if you get all kind of cranked up on this is my idea and I'm going there, you're doomed. You're in a foggy room searching for the light, and it's on the end of a firefly, and then they canceled the TV series. So you're wandering. Be happy. Start small. Small groups have a much better chance of being innovative. I don't know why, but some companies, and certainly Sun fell into this trap a couple of times. Senior management would have some brilliant idea for some innovative direction we could go, and they would instantly put like 500 people on the project. and nobody would, and just, as far as I'm concerned, anybody who starts a project with like more than like maybe 7 people, it's just guaranteed doomed.
It's like AFS at IBM.
Yeah.
It was like 400 scientists got called into Yorktown and.
Yeah. Yeah, just about. I mean, IBM did this all the time with giant projects. Although and of course one of the problems with small groups is that eventually you have to have this like, Fisher cut bait kind of moment. It's either you either go and do the big thing, or you just say nah, and you go off and do something else. And if you just like keep worrying it, you just fritter your life away. Isolation is a really good thing, or at least being away from the old ways and away from sort of the narrow vision. I mean, one of the hardest things that happens in research groups is you sort of bring a lot of baggage with you from what you've done before. Sometimes it's good inspiration, sometimes it's just baggage. If you happen to be at a company trying to do innovation, the people around you, they all have kind of a genetic code that's trying to guide you into building the same thing as you built the last time, because that's what they understand. And most of the successful projects that I've been involved with have had some degree of isolation, sort of firewalled away from people who are like picking away at them, away from all the infighting.
Away from what other people are doing, because if there's 5 companies doing something and you enter the fray, you've only got a 1 in 6 chance.
Right.
If you do something radically different, which appears equally valuable on the merits, then you've got the 100% chance of being the company that makes it if the merits turn out to cash in.
Right, and part of that, I mean, that's one of the failure modes around here, right? The venture capitalists, they kind of want to do things that are safe, so Facebook does well, and then the VCs fund, a dozen Facebook clones. And, the chances of any one of them making a dent on Facebook is so close to zero. And
It's $100 billion, and if I just get 1%.
if I just get 1%, yeah. Sorry, guys, it ain't gonna happen. And besides which, there's so much of Facebook that was luck anyway.
Google was an Alta Vista clone.
Yeah, although at least they had a twist, right? And just and the
Another advantage, they weren't owned by debt.
well, yes. Yeah.
No, it was a little more complicated than that. There's a fellow, everybody hears about Larry and Sergey. There's another fellow named Luis Gravano. And Luis did an absolutely fantastic thing in that quarter. He invited everybody who developed a search engine to come speak here, which was an awesome thing. And Larry and Sergey, I remember them sitting on the side when they were hearing all this stuff. And they just snickered because they thought, these guys are losers. We have this completely different way of thinking about things. Luis Gravano is the unspoken for, because he brought the guys who did Alta Vista. He brought Steve Kirsch who did InfoSeek. He brought everybody at the time who had written a search engine to speak here at Stanford. It was truly an amazing time. I have notes from all that.
Well, and also Larry and Sergey were listening to people who were kind of odd. So I know they had a conversation with a librarian here, and asked her, what makes how do you know that a paper is important?
Well, Rebecca and Vicki and the other librarians that were part of the project, they were all this bigger umbrella thing that we funded.
Yeah.
As well too.
Right, but listening to people who are smart people but like not in the middle of things is something that people often neglect to do. Right? If you just listened to people doing search engine stuff, you wouldn't have listened to the librarians. Right. And they happen to listen to the librarians. And they were right. And it's one of these things where in the library world, they've got literally centuries of history in what makes a paper important, and And if it worked in the 18th century, it'll work today.
It's carried over the librarian's ethics.
It's hard to know. I mean, the Google guys are kind of odd. They internally believe that they're acting very ethically. External perception is that maybe things are a little creepy. And it's hard to tell whether it's actually creepy or just the Google guys aren't very good at telling the story. And my suspicion is that they're actually being unfairly criticized. From what I know from people inside Google, they're actually, pretty good on the privacy scale compared to where they could be, and certainly compared to what a lot of other folks are. But it feels like nobody knows that.
We fall in the uncanny valley of companies.
In what sense?
Well, the uncanny valley is the idea that an animation or a picture, as it becomes more and more lifelike, at a certain point starts looking creepy rather than real. Okay? And there is an analogous dip just before you start calling it Procter & Gamble.
Yeah.
They're in that dip.
Right. And so it's hard to know. I think I've beaten that one to death. Craziness. Creative people are crazy. Companies hate crazy people because they rock the boat. I've always believed that crazy people are good. I've been accused of being one myself. And crazy people are often the ones that let the train jump the tracks. I used to have this kind of stupid belief that arbitrarily crazy people should be tolerated because they, just really, really creative people who are arbitrarily dysfunctional. But I've had enough,
So we should
enough learning experiences that I don't actually believe that.
should tolerate Gaddafi, you mean?
Yeah, well,
Sorry.
yeah, there are a few other. Well, he's tall. He's crazy without being brilliant.
Oh.
The people who are brilliant and crazy. I mean, most of the brilliant people I know are at some level are kind of crazy, and there are definitely limits. And one of the ways that some companies and Sun tended to do this way is to use research lab as a place to park crazy people, because they were like so socially dysfunctional that they couldn't actually interact properly with real people, and so you'd have this kind of resting home for crazy people, and of course it can, and sometimes you find labs that really turn that way, and they're just kind of like a parking place. I know at Sun we tried really hard not to do that, but there were certainly instances. When it comes to innovating, at a lot of places there's and this is more about some places there's this belief that you have like innovators who design stuff, and then you have people who build it, and that just feels like it doesn't work to me. I really don't believe in the term software architect, because it sort of assumes that there's like a software architect and then there are the people who build it, and every place I've ever been that has that kind of a split, the architects tend to be kind of clueless because they have no idea what goes down in the basement of the systems, and they come up with designs that the people who get stuck with them look at and go, this is dumb, you can't build this, and then they ignore it and they just do the right thing anyway. And with so much of innovation, it tends to revolve around little details. The thing that the magic little nut in the middle that you can or cannot make work. And as innovations and designs change, you really have to iterate up and down, in all the levels, from the lowest nitty details to the big stuff. And the people who are designing this stuff have to be comfortable all over the place. One of the things that I believe in this sort of implementation, sort of construction phase is I'm a big believer in throwing things out. I'm almost embarrassed by the number of lines of code in today's shipping Java systems that actually have my name attached to them. It should be much smaller. It should be 0. But there are all kinds of things that never got fixed. So when you've finally got something, what do you do with it? And this is really more about how you get things out. In lots of places, people confuse building a demo with the actual engineering, and they're radically different. They have nothing to do with each other. But it's frightening how many people build the demo and then ship it. Or if you go and you talk to folks at Facebook, they're like, they have this system that was architected for like 40,000 people, and then binder twined up, and every now and then they kind of re-architect a little bit, but it never got the sort of full engineering that it ought to, and that happens. That is just everywhere.
QA is for customers.
Yeah, QA is for customers. It's an attitude that's everywhere, right? And at some level, the customers have to be doing some of the QA because customers do stuff that you would never ever predict. But lots of folks do way less QA than they ought to. And in the Java world, I think we were maybe a little goofy in that we had a test suite of several 100,000 test programs. I forget that, and they sort of the number was shifting because we would like merge them together. We had just like a giant test suite, and we really kind of overdid it. No. Internal politics. Most fresh graduates out of college, they sort of have gone through college and they haven't noticed most of the politics that exist in their university, even though most universities are intensely political. And then they find themselves into this nice company, and they've got this bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, eager beaver bunny rabbit thing going, and then they wonder why everybody hates them, and they're hated for all kinds of weird reasons, organizations, they develop antibodies. They always want to make things look like what the things that they understand, which tends to be in engineering organizations the thing that they built the last. And they're always, bending these new things to look like the old things. Sun managed a very, very small number of fundamental shifts. There are all kinds of things that we should have made big changes in that we never managed to because they always got bent into looking like the last thing we did. Certainly in the hardware world, that was always happening. They were trying to get us off of Spark or off of a certain way of building chassis was always really, really hard. And then organizations, it's mammalian behavior 101. Mammals are territorial. It just gets ugly. Get over it. So when you're doing technology transfer, when you've got often when in these research labs there's this real tension of how you get the ideas out, and one of the temptations, and it's certainly something we tried to do a lot at Sun, even though it was just almost never actually worked, which was to come up with some new product in a research lab, and then to try to get the product group to sort of take it over and ship it. And then whenever that happens, the product group, by and large, doesn't really understand, and they twist it, and it turns into what they shipped the last time. And sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It depends on how incremental you're trying to be. The thing that usually works is to not try to change the company. You just don't change the formula for Coke. You create something new. The oldest engineering company on the planet started in 1526, selling guns to the Doge of Venice, and it's the Beretta company. They serve handguns to 007, and they're in the business of making things blow up and people die. But they've been an innovative engineering country for many hundreds of years, and in the history of engineering textbooks, they're always put up as a really interesting example because they never ever tried to retool a factory. As a general principle, they didn't retool factories. They built new factories, and then they would just plow the old factory under, and the new factory would do its thing. And they had been doing that sort of as a general principle for several hundred years, and it worked really well. Obsolete yourself. This is sort of classic crossing the chasm stuff. It was sort of like the PCRT story, right? The PCRT could do for $10,000 what the mainframe groups at IBM were doing for 1 to 5 million. And eventually, IBM sort of kills all that off, except that then young whippersnappers like Sun and DEC start actually doing that, and IBM ends up in a world of pain. And of course, they were still making like boatloads of money off of their mainframes, but not as much money as they could have been if there weren't folks who had crossed the chasm or just sort of sprung into existence on the other side of the chasm. Certainly at Sun, we had all kinds of fights along this line. Like one that we actually succeeded on was making the transition from the Motorola 68000 processors to the SPARC processors. We had huge internal fights over that because we were making a lot of money off the Motorola processors. We would be selling a lot fewer machines if we did SPARC for a lot lower price. We would be making less money to deliver the same amount of compute power. But that was one of the ones where Andy was absolutely right, and he was in some sense a complete asshole on the topic, and he actually quit Sun, started Moon Microsystems, and then he got bought back. And he kind of humiliated the sort of engineering status quo into doing the right thing. I think I talked about that one. Really running out of time here. External politics. I should say something about this because this, when you're doing sort of innovative software. Or interesting software of any kind, there's always these weird competitive pressures from all kinds of different directions. I did a Windows system a bunch of years ago, a thing called News, the Networked Extensible Windows System. John is rolling his eyes. Yes, much blood in the streets. And that one, was one where, we had done NFS. NFS had been really successful. NFS had been sort of forced down the throats of many of our competitors by their customers. In particular, the folks at DEC were really angry about NFS because, damn it, those assholes in California, did this thing that their customers really liked, so they had to adopt NFS. And then we did news, and DEC said, that's not going to happen again. So they started this consortium that had everybody except Sun was invited, and actually when they had their first press conference, they actually had guards by the door, asking everybody their corporate affiliation, and they were blocking people who said they were from Sun from going in. And that became X11. And it's just like really, it's just surprising what the world does. And at Sun, we, Sun tended to have a lot of people who were, hippies, hippie kind of, who would like, you mean somebody could actually hate us? and the whole X11 consortium thing, took a lot of people kind of by surprise. And why would DEC do that? We were just doing something cool. And it's like, no. And of course, the free software movement has had quite an impact on things. One of the things that people really don't get in the software world often is the economy of scale. I mean, software is this really weird thing. If you compare software to a chair, right? So when you build a thing, there's kind of two components to the cost. There's kind of the unit cost, what we'll call like the cost of goods sold, and then there's like this upfront engineering, the non-recurring engineering. And if you're selling a bazillion of things, you take the non-recurring engineering number, you divide it by the volume, and that's kind of the cost that gets added on. And then you take those two costs, the engineering divided by volume, add the unit cost, multiply that by some markup factor, and that's kind of the list price. And so if you get something like a chair, the volume is probably going to be huge. So you can divide the NRE by something close to infinity. So it's the unit cost, and it's kind of like what it costs to manufacture a chair times some profit. Software is one where the unit cost, it tends to be like so close to zero. In the days of CDs, it's like $1. But the upfront engineering tended to be huge. So if you were like a small company trying to do something with a few customers, your price tag was really, what it cost you to build the thing divided by the number of copies you sold. So if you're trying to do like a text editor or something. But if you're doing a text editor and you're competing against Microsoft gets to, take the upfront engineering divided by infinity because their volume was gigantic, just sort of automatically. So when the unit cost is approximately zero, engineering design divided by volume is approximately zero, price is kind of zero. And so the software world, if you just put your accounting hat on, it kind of drives towards the free model, right? And especially when people can find other ways to get money out of the ecosystem, right? So there used to be a really healthy business in software development tools. But then Microsoft decided that software development tools were a good way to control the developer population. So they dropped their tool price way below what almost anybody could afford to compete with them. And so Borland and Symantec and all those folks went out of business. And then developer tools worldwide turned into a sort of a charity business. The whole lot of stuff that from a sort of a corporate perspective, often that's kind of where some of the motivation for some of this free software comes from, is that you just, the math is weird. And so trying to do a product in the software world is really hard. Boy, I'm in time trouble here. I'm going to skip this. One of the things that engineers have a really hard time with is getting people excited about what they're doing. I can't tell you how many times I'd go home, be like really, really excited with talking to my wife about stuff that made absolutely no sense to her. And my wife's a smart person, right? I mean, she was, in the PhD math program at Purdue, ended up with an MBA from Wharton, did lots of simulation software of like chemical engineering plants. She's a smart person, and I would, and I'd give her these like geeky spiels, and she'd go, stop, when you explain something to somebody, an engineer will tend to talk about the engineering things that excite them. And almost never does that actually make a difference to the person you're talking to, right? You have to learn how to explain an innovation in terms that actually make a difference to the other person in their life. And certainly in the case of Java, one of the things that my wife made me do was write down I am a bank or a why does this make a difference to me? And she made me write down this white paper that had like half a dozen scenarios. If you can hook people based on what a difference it makes to whatever their life is, and then they get excited, and then you can say, well, then this is how we do that. That really makes a difference in selling the idea, right? So simple thing like if I had to pick like one technology to be proud of in Java, it's getting people to actually use garbage collectors, right? I didn't invent garbage collectors. I just got a lot of people to use them, and so really early on, I had this conversation with a really big bank. I was at their engineering headquarters in London. And I asked them, you're a giant bank. Java's only been out a few years. You guys are like headlong into this whole Java thing. Why did you do this? This seems kind of crazy, right? Banks felt to me like the last place. You think that they would be like really conservative. So this guy told me this story, that they had this transaction clearing system. That wasn't a really high volume system. It was kind of in the middle of their whole, daily accounting process. But this server, which was all written in C++, had a bug somewhere, and it had a storage leak. And they had tiger teams of people trying to find this storage leak, and they didn't know what the hell was going on with this system. But it worked just fine, so long as they rebooted, once a day. The leakage wasn't too bad, but they couldn't run it continuously, and they were getting into this like panic because they were running out of hours in the day during which they could reboot it because their trading was becoming more and more global. They didn't have like a slot where they could reboot it because the reboot actually took a fair while because it had to build a lot of like large data structures before it could start. And so there was a couple of their engineers, for some reason, it was sort of like an educational thing for them. They decided that they would try building that server in Java. And they had all the test data, they had all the test logs, and they built it. It apparently was a fairly simple system, so it didn't take them a whole long time. And he said that they had gone to their manager and said, hey, we built this prototype. Could we try, and it passes all the test suites. Could we try running it while the production system is rebooting? And then the manager said, yeah, as soon as it crashes or does something wrong, we'll swap it out. And it just kept on running, and it kept on running, and it kept on running, and days passed, and it kept on running. And, you know, the garbage collector would garbage collect, and there was no leaks, and it actually worked, and it had passed all their tests. And, this is the kind of thing that, like, senior management actually notices, right? That this transaction system actually works. It doesn't crash. It just keeps on chugging. And this caused, something of an internal fire drill. And then you can get back and you can explain to the manager, well, it's all because of this funny, technology called garbage collection, and yada, 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 right? And, the way that most engineers explain garbage collection, it sounds like an excuse for engineers to be lazy because they don't want to pick up their garbage. And that's not what it's all about, right? If you can figure out how to tell the story, it's how to tell the story in a way that makes a difference to people. I'm going to get shot by my wife here. That's probably innovation is easy. It's transferring to a product is the hard part. Innovation is the fun part. One of the things that was kind of a principle at Sun that we tried to follow was that the people who invented stuff had to follow it out into the product group, because if you just threw it over the wall, the people who were supposed to pick it up, I mean, it's kind of like, if you write an academic paper and you publish it, and then you expect people to actually like do that, you find that they do something just different. They maybe like harvest a few ideas, but they also along the way probably miss a few key ideas. And so we really believed in this sort of continuity of passion, that the people have to follow the ideas. Often that's got its own problems because the people who come out of the labs tend to be a little on the dysfunctional side, but otherwise, life wouldn't be fun. Anyway, thanks. I'm about to be shot.
Will those non-slides be available?
They're online already. Already there.
Why did you give them to an existing product you mentioned?
For more, please visit us at stanford.edu.